Hi, everyone. I am Iya Affo, the Director of Training and Development for the Arizona ACE Consortium and the Resilience Empowerment Project, and welcome to our March newsletter. Let's talk PBIS. So since 2018 or in 2018, there were 27,000 schools across the United States that were using the positive behavioral intervention support framework in our schools. We're currently using that framework here in Arizona. And really, despite the emphasis on PBIS's emphasis on student well-being, there are many people that believe who believe that PBIS really serves as a way to label, punish, and surveil, and perhaps hyper label, hyper punish, and hyper surveil our students. And although it's represented as supporting the social, emotional, and academic wellness for students, educators, and families, many do believe that it upholds or even creates harm. Because, it has that three-tiered system, and it really focuses a lot on data collection. And so from that perspective, it makes it very difficult for the school or the classroom to have a hierarchical environment, right? So that there's no domination and subjugation happening. Further, PBIS really does not disrupt racist beliefs like deficit views or color evasiveness, and it really sees cultural responsiveness as an add-on. There was a Harvard study that I read a couple of years back, and I will try to link that in the section below the video. But there was a Harvard study that talked about how students of color from age 0 to 8 were several times more likely to be considered stupid and lazy, right? From age 0, even, age 0 to 8. So PBIS does not at all help to disrupt any of these deficit views and and ultimately racist beliefs. So what we have found is that as schools seek to implement trauma-informed practices, right? Because over the past 10 plus years, we start talking about trauma-informed care, trauma-informed practices, the importance of being trauma-informed, and of course, it heightened even more during the pandemic. What we're starting to see is that schools try to plug trauma-informed education into existing PBIS systems. But the PBIS system is a framework for managing behavior, and it has its roots in behaviorism. So it doesn't honor the neurological or the physiological impact of trauma or examine environmental factors that might cause certain behaviors, right? Certain school cultures that might drive behavior. And it also doesn't take a look at how the adults are showing up in the environment, right? How are the adults setting the tone, setting the culture, or interacting with students? So if we look, right, on the opposite end, which is where trauma-informed education lies, trauma-informed education is more of a human-centered approach, and it seeks to transform learning environments and education policy to be more supportive of trauma-affected people and to prevent trauma from occurring in the schools. These two approaches, PBIS and trauma-informed education, are fundamentally different, and many will go as far as to say that combining the two are harmful to students, and especially students of color or students with disabilities. If we look at SAMHSA's principles of trauma-informed care, right? There's safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration, empowerment, voice, and choice. And lastly, cultural, historic, and gender issues. All of those are SAMHSA's principles for trauma-informed care. If we take a look at the PBIS system and we look, let's say, we start with Tier 1. Well, even the language that's used in Tier 1 contradict trauma-informed principles because the focus is on encouraging what they're calling normal behavior, and that we know upholds ableism and racism. The repeated use of the term unwanted behavior is really prioritizing the needs of the adult versus understanding behavior as an effort to communicate needs or a natural reaction to one's surroundings or environment or conditions of the student, right? Because the student behavior is communication. A student's behavior is communicating needs or a reaction or a natural response to the environment in which they exist. And when we place importance on adult needs versus the child, we're really diminishing the humanity of the child, and we're facilitating hyper punishment. SAMHSA also suggests that applying a trauma-informed lens requires, one, the realization of the widespread impact of trauma, two, to recognize signs and symptoms of trauma, and three, to respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and four, actively resisting re-traumatization. So when PBIS leaves the context of trauma and the impact of oppression on a student's life and behavior out of their materials, it really denies the realities of the impact of trauma. It blocks recognition of its signs and symptoms. It fails to create a responsive environment, and it does nothing to resist re-traumatization. If we look at Tier 2, we see the term problematic behavior a lot, or problem behavior. And again, this places emphasis on the adult's perspective of a problem rather than, supporting any curiosity of underlying needs of the child, right? Or, really emphasizing what those behaviors are trying to communicate or what those behaviors are in response to. So that term, problem behavior, also indicates that there's a deficit in terms of the student. There's some type of deficit in the student, which then is creating this behavior. So there's really no mention of trauma, of the effect of race or racism on behaviors, or the fact that trauma, race, racism, oppression could be the reason for these so-called problem behaviors. Tier 2 also talks about increasing adult supervision, right? And that often means like a one-to-one support person. And when we have that happen, we start to see that hyper-surveillance. And the hyper-surveillance is going to lead to hyper-labeling, right? We've heard terms, SPED kids, or Tier 2 kids, or trauma kids, so forth and so on. And then when we take a look at Tier 3, in that framework, Tier 3 is designed for only 1 to 5% of the population. And the language there really indicates people in Tier 3 are rare and they're dangerous. And it leads to having a certain bias toward those kids, that hyper labeling. Often, right, Tier 2 and Tier 3 is overpopulated with boys and children of color. They're often removed off-site to receive services someplace else. And so we also know that this labeling and tracking of students really starts to feed the school to prison pipeline. And there's been a lot of affiliation between the PBIS framework and the school to prison pipeline that we know exists across the United States. Also in Tier 3, we have a lot of language around positively reinforcing appropriate behavior and reducing rewards for unwanted behavior, right? Which is a euphemism for punishment. These phrases all, speak to the ideas of behaviorism, and they really emphasize a coercive adult-child relationship and that abled-disabled relationship, which really stands in direct opposition to trauma-informed principles of empowerment and collaboration. So really, if we look at PBIS, we can see that it tends to be trauma-inducing. So if we have one system that is set up to be trauma-informed and recognize trauma and prevent re-traumatization, trauma-informed education, and we have another system that upholds dominant culture and ableist notions of norms and erases multidimensional identities, and applies deficit labels to students whose identities maybe have been marginalized, especially in regard to race and disability, we're going to see that PBIS really is not in alignment with fundamental trauma-informed principles. So we might need to take a look at applying the positive behavioral intervention support tiered system in our schools. So just some food for thought. If you'd like further information about this topic, about PBIS, in relationship to being trauma informed, I will link some resources below. All right, I hope you enjoyed, and I hope it serves you. Thank you. Take care. See you soon.